Pardon me while I take a drink. You know, living in a small town has many benefits, and it also has some drawbacks that are part of living here. And, there's benefits to living in a small town, such as the fact that everybody knows who you are. People care what's going on in your life. People look out for you and for others. There's also drawbacks to living in a small town. Everybody knows who you are. They care about what's going on in your life. And they look out for you and for others. One of the things that's interesting about living in a small town is that news travels very quickly, and bad news travels especially quickly throughout the town. And I'd like to think that the reason is because people are concerned and they want to make sure that everybody's aware of what's going on. But the truth is that it doesn't really matter whether the news is true or not. If it's bad, it travels quickly. And usually that news leaves in its wake waves that affect people's lives. And so when someone is talked about in town, it affects their reputation long term. It takes a long time for them to rebuild their reputation, regardless of whether the story about them was true or not. And what we're going to look at this morning is that the Apostle Paul faced a kind of a similar situation. In Corinth, people had been talking about him and had apparently been saying all sorts of things about him. Now, those statements weren't true, but it didn't mean that Paul, didn't have to worry about them. He had to overcome the accusations that had been made about him. He had to re-earn the trust of the Corinthian church. And so that's what we're going to be looking at this morning, is how he did that. Now, if you recall last week, at the beginning of 2 Corinthians chapter 8, we talked about how Paul was asking the Corinthians to be generous in donating to the church in Jerusalem, and that they were going to be taking up this collection. Now, the reason he was asking them to donate to the church in Jerusalem was because the church in Jerusalem was undergoing a severe famine, and so they were in great need, and he says, hey, you guys can help out, participate in this, and help out in some way. The problem was that people had made all sorts of accusations against Paul. And one of the accusations, apparently, was that Paul was only in this whole preaching thing for the money. That's all he was really concerned about, was his own well-being. And so, clearly, when Paul says, hey, we're going to come and collect money, he understood that there were going to be some people who would not give to the Lord because they didn't trust Paul. And he says, that's a problem. I don't want to be in the way. So Paul sought to get out of the way. He sought to remove any obstacles that people had to giving to the Lord. And he tried to show them what his motives were by the way that he acted. And that's what we see in our passage this morning in verses 16 through 24 of 2 Corinthians chapter 8, where Paul is coming up with a solution. He's showing how he's going to respond to this issue that happens, the issue of a bad reputation that he has amongst some people in Corinth. And so that's what we're going to be looking at this morning. And in verses 16 through 19, and then also in verse 22, Paul talks about how he's going to handle this whole collection of the money thing in light of what's going on. And this is what he says. He says, but thank God, he has given Titus the same enthusiasm for you that I have. Titus welcomed our request that he visit you again. In fact, he himself was very eager to go and see you. We are also sending another brother with Titus. All the churches praise him as a preacher of the good news. He was appointed by the churches to accompany us as we take the offering to Jerusalem, a service that glorifies the Lord and shows our eagerness to help. And if we skip down to verse 22, he says, we are also sending with them another of our brothers who has proven himself many times and has shown on many occasions how eager he is. He is now even more enthusiastic because of his great confidence in you. So what Paul said was that he was going to send these group of people to go and handle the collection in Jerusalem because he knew that it would allay suspicion that was on him. And what we're going to look at this morning are, I think, three principles or three things that we can learn from the way that Paul handled this situation. When people don't trust us, when people are unsure of the integrity, we can take Paul's approach here to ensure to people what our true motives are. And so the first thing that we see is that Paul sent a group rather than an individual. He placed this responsibility on a group and not on an individual. And the reason this is important is because we understand that having a group of people responsible for something builds in an additional layer of security. It makes it so that every member of the group can hold every other member of the group accountable. And so it helps to prevent any wrongdoing. It helps to ensure that things are being handled as they should. When I helped with Boy Scouts for several years as a leader there, they had this kind of built into their culture. They called it too deep leadership. And the idea, and the reason they had this was because they'd been burned in the past. And so they had implemented this idea of too deep leadership in order to protect the kids and the adults involved. And the idea was simple, that anytime that you have leaders with kids, there should be at least 2 responsible adult leaders who are there. And what the reasoning for that was is that when you have 2 responsible adult leaders who are there, they can ensure that neither one of them get off track and do something that they shouldn't. So, if one leader says, hey, I've got a fun idea. Let's take 7-year-olds and jump off of a cliff into the water. The other leader could say, maybe we should think about that for a second. That probably might not be the best idea. And you kind of rein each other in. It also provides additional strength that if you've dealt with kids, you need additional strength at times. And so it allows the 2 people to work together to have some additional strength and to ensure the safety of the kids as well as to ensure the quality of the work that is done. That's basically what Paul was saying here. We're sending a group because it's going to ensure that things are handled properly. It's going to ensure that nothing happens to your money. It will be delivered as it should. So that's the first thing, is that Paul placed the responsibility on a group rather than on an individual. The second thing is that we see the kind of people that Paul and the churches chose. They chose people of character to be part of this group. They didn't just go to the church and say, hey, who'd like to go take a trip to Jerusalem? And then take whoever raised their hands. That's not how they handled this. This was a situation where they were carefully selecting people for the job. Now, the first person that they selected was Titus, and that was Paul's selection. Paul selected Titus because he had worked alongside of Titus for a long time. He had done all sorts of things with Titus, and he said, hey, I can vouch for this guy. I've worked alongside of him. I trust him. He works hard. He has the right heart, and he can be trusted. He said, Titus is only concerned about honoring the Lord, and really that's what we really are looking for in someone who's going to participate in this group. So Paul sent Titus, but then he also had 2 other people who went with him. And Paul didn't select those people, the church did. And we don't have a great deal of information about either of the other 2 people who went with him, but we have a little bit. And we are told about the first guy in verses 18 and 19. It says, we are sending another brother with Titus. All the churches praise him as a preacher of the good news. He was appointed by the churches to accompany us as we take the offering to Jerusalem. So what we're told is that this guy was known as a preacher of the good news. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that he was a pastor. What it means is that the people in the church had seen this man was concerned with the gospel and the way that he lived his life. This man was concerned with living for the Lord. He was concerned with pointing other people to Jesus. And we also can assume from this that they viewed him as someone who was trustworthy. They were concerned about this man's character and had seen that he was a man of strong character. And it says that he was approved, or he was appointed by the churches to accompany him. And it's interesting, the Greek word for appointed literally means he was selected by the raising of hands. In other words, he was voted on by the church, which tells us that apparently he had a good reputation in the church. They viewed him as someone who was trustworthy, someone who really was seeking to honor the Lord. And that's an important trait. Now, the other man we have even less information on. We're told about him in verse 22, and we're just told that he has proven himself many times and has shown on many occasions how eager he is. And what that tells us, again, is he is someone whose reputation shows he can be trusted. And it shows that he wants to serve the Lord in everything that he does. And here's what I think is important as we look at this. We don't see anything about any skills that these men have. We aren't told that they're businessmen. We aren't told that they're accountants or bankers or anything else. We aren't told about their skills. We're told about their character. And the reason I think that we aren't told about their skills is because all that really mattered, or what was most important, was their character. The people understood that the most important trait for someone in the church is their character, who they really are. How do they live? What is their motivation? What are they seeking to accomplish in life? How are they living? That's instructive for us within the church as well. We should be people who are looking for people who are men and women of character. Before we go and pick someone to serve in the church, we should ask, what is their character like? And we go, well, how do we know what someone's character is like? Well, we look at their life. Does their life reflect someone who is seeking to honor the Lord in every area of life? Or are they only playing the game on Sunday morning? Are they someone who is honestly trying to honor God in their business, in their homes, in their activities? If not, we should say, if they aren't doing that in all the other areas of life, what makes us think that suddenly they're going to do that when we put them in leadership in the church? Nothing should change. They're going to be the same person in either place. But when we have the person who is consistent in the way that they live outside of the church, when they act with integrity in their business, when they seem to be concerned about honoring the Lord in the way that they live, when we see this consistency in their lives, then we say we can be confident that this person will live this way as they have responsibility within the church as well. And so that's what we should be looking for as we find people who serve in the church. And the truth is, those are the kinds of traits that we should be trying to cultivate in ourselves. We should strive to be people of character, because more than any skills or anything else that we have, who we are is most important. We're very aware of this anytime that we go to try and fill vacancies within the church. We get a nominating committee together and say, hey, here's these spots that we need to fill. And we try and emphasize as we do this that what we're looking for is character, not skills. And practically speaking, what that means is we say, well, someone who teaches school throughout the week doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be a good Sunday school teacher. If they aren't seeking the Lord, then we don't want them teaching Sunday school. No matter how many wonderful teaching skills they may have, we want someone who's teaching from their own experience. They're teaching what they have lived already. We have people who make decisions about money, people who are helping with the business decisions of the church. Well, it's one thing to say, hey, this person has a successful business. Maybe we should put them in leadership. Well, not necessarily. Unless a person has the right mentality, the right kind of character, they shouldn't be making business decisions in the church, because the church is different than a worldly business. We aren't in it for profit. We're in it for Jesus. We aren't in it for trying to make money. We're in it for trying to make disciples. And if we have the wrong mentality, then we're going to make the wrong kinds of decisions. And so what we look for is people of character. So that's the second thing, is that Paul and the churches there selected men of character to have this responsibility. The third thing is that the group wasn't selected by Paul alone. And that seems like maybe it's kind of a silly point to make, but think through this for a minute. If Paul had said, hey, I know you guys don't trust me, but here's a group of 3 men that I handpicked to come and take the money and handle it for me, and they're going to take care of it for you. How do you think his critics are going to respond? They're going to say, all this is, Paul, is a ploy for you to still control these men, and they're going to do what you want anyhow. All they're doing, it's just a way for you to make yourself look good. You're still in it for the money. So Paul took a different approach. He appointed Titus. He said, I want Titus to go because I trust him. He's a good guy to go. But then he asked the churches to select other people. And the churches selected these 2 men who they trusted. The churches said, these are people who we trust. These are people who we are going to put in charge because we have seen how they are, and we can trust them. It put Paul above suspicion. It made it so that people didn't see Paul as trying to control this group. These were men who were acting on their own. You know, in the corporate world, people understand this. They take this approach all the time. The way the corporate world typically works is you have a CEO who's in charge of the day-to-day operations of a business. But then you also have a board of directors that the CEO answers to. And the CEO doesn't get to appoint who's on the board of directors. If he does, then it's a bad system. But the idea is that it creates some accountability there. And so that everybody works together to ensure that the best interests of the company are being met. And we try and take the same approach in the church. And that's the way we should approach things in the church, that there shouldn't be a situation where in a church there is one person with all the power. Even if that person's the pastor, there shouldn't be one person who has all the power, because we as human beings are sinful. It's dangerous to let one person run everything. And there's this disturbing trend in many churches today, or amongst many pastors at least, where pastors will say, listen, God has given me the responsibility of leading this church and caring for this church, which is a true statement. But then they go further and they say, therefore, since God has given me the responsibility, that means that you need to do whatever I say. Now, I haven't been a pastor for a really long time, but I've been a pastor long enough here that I could say, yeah, how would that go over? Hey, listen, you guys need to do what I say. I have a feeling that they'd say, we say you need to leave. And that wouldn't go over well. And there's a reason for that. It's a bad idea. That's not the way that it's supposed to work. We are supposed to rely on one another to seek the Lord. It builds in accountability, and we try and do that in our churches, or in our church here. As the pastors here, we don't have control over everything. We are members of every board that exists in our church. However, we do not have a vote on any of those boards. We are members ex officio. We are simply there to advise and to offer our insights and opinions to people, and the boards ultimately make the decisions on their own. We don't select who gets on the boards. The congregation does. We have a committee who says, hey, let's find the people who are best for this job, and then we'll present it to the congregation and let them make those decisions about who should be in leadership. And ultimately, everything comes back to the congregation. The pastors aren't in charge. And the reason that we have it set up this way is not because we don't trust us. I'd like to think, hopefully, that you trust us as well. The reason is because we believe that it's a bad idea to let one person control everything. Because when we work together, we can hold each other accountable and ensure that we stay on task and are working toward what the Lord wants. So, what we see here is the three things that Paul has tried to do. He has tried to do these three things as a way of demonstrating to people what his true motivation is. And we're going to look at that here in verses 20 and 21. We've looked at what Paul did. Now we're going to see why Paul did it. And this is what he says in verses 20 and 21. He says, we are traveling together to guard against any criticism for the way we are handling this generous gift. We are careful to be honorable before the Lord, but we also want everyone else to see that we are honorable. It's interesting because certainly Paul was concerned about handling the money properly. He wanted to make sure the money got to Jerusalem, that it wasn't stolen, that nobody had, embezzled it or anything like that. He wanted to ensure the integrity of the money, but I think there was a much deeper level here, that Paul wanted to ensure that people saw his motivation. He wanted people to know what they were trying to do, that it wasn't about him, it was about honoring the Lord with their offerings. And so that's why he took this course. Now, it's interesting that Paul says, we're careful to be honorable before the Lord, but we also want everyone else to see that we are honorable. And that sounds kind of strange to us. We say, so wait a second, was Paul more concerned about how everybody else viewed him than he was about how the Lord viewed him? No, and yes. Yes, because he understood that God knows what's in our hearts. God can see our hearts. God knows our motivations. And so the one that we want to impress the most is the Lord. We want him to understand our motivations. The problem is, the Lord understands our motivations. Other people don't. Other people are left to infer our motivations from our actions. And Paul understood that he needed to live in such a way that people could clearly see what his motivations were. He needed to live in a way that was beyond reproach so that they had no question about what he was trying to do. And we say, well, why did Paul care? Why did Paul care what people thought of him? Well, I don't think he really did, because there were a lot of people who didn't like Paul. But Paul's concern was that he understood that his reputation reflected on the Lord. What people believed about Paul influenced what they would believe about God. And even beyond that, he understood that if people viewed him as not being trustworthy, then they wouldn't trust what he had to say about Jesus. Paul understood there was a great deal at stake here. It wasn't just about him. It was about how he represented the Lord. We need to have the same mentality. We need to recognize that we are Christ's ambassadors, that what people conclude about the message of the gospel is in part due to what they see in us. And people's view of God is colored by their view of us. And so we need to make sure that we are living with integrity. Billy Graham, who many of you know, who was a phenomenal evangelist and very prolific evangelist through the years ago, started his crusades. And he would go into cities and he would preach to people in large stadiums. And as he began to get more and more popular, the ministry would bring in more and more money. And Dr. Graham saw an issue here. He said, there's a problem that if people think that I'm just trying to enrich myself, they're not going to trust what I have to say about Jesus. And he said, I need to make sure that people can trust what I have to say about Jesus, because that's the most important thing. So early on in his ministry, Billy Graham said, I don't want to be in charge of the money. I don't want that to be my responsibility. So they selected some Christian businessmen of strong character to handle all of the financial decisions in the organization. And so those men made the decisions about how the finances would be handled. And then they made those decisions public. So that if you wanted to, you could go and you can check and you can see where they were spending their money. And we say, well, that seems like overkill. Why would they have to do that? Here is the reason why. Billy said, I don't want anyone to think for a minute that I can't be trusted. I don't want anyone to think that this is about the money for me. It's about Jesus. And if you've got any questions about that, go look at our books. He wanted to be able to point to people and say, you want to see my motivation? Here it is. In our church, we try and do kind of the same thing. We want to ensure that our finances are handled properly, and we want to be transparent about it. I have no idea what any of you give, because I don't count the money, I don't handle the money, I don't see who gives anything. We've got other people who handle that. The way that our finances are handled, just so you know, every week 2 people take the money and they count it, and then they deposit it at the bank. 2 people count it together so that we're ensuring that it's there. And then they bring it back and tell us what's been deposited. One person is charged with writing checks in our church. And then we have other people who are charged with signing checks. The people who write checks can't sign checks. And the people who sign checks can't write checks. It's not because we don't trust those people, but it's because we want people to understand that we are trying to be people of character and integrity. The way that our money is spent is we have our church council, who's elected by the church, makes decisions about how money should be spent. They put together a budget each year and present it to the congregation. They present the whole budget. Every dime that we plan to spend during the course of the next year is presented to the congregation so everybody knows what we're planning to do. If there's any questions, we say, come talk to us. We want to explain it to you. We don't want to try and be secretive. We don't want to try and hide behind people because we want people to understand we aren't in this for money. Our goal isn't to make profit. Our goal is to make disciples. And we don't want how we handle our money to distract people from what we're really all about. That's what Paul was doing here. He understood what was at stake, and he wanted to ensure that people could see his motivation. Now, I've talked a lot this morning about money, because that's what this passage is talking about, and integrity in dealing with money. And I've also talked about, how that applies to us as a church. But the truth is, I believe that there's applications that go beyond this. I believe that there's applications to this as far as us as individuals. And it goes even beyond how we handle our money. And I've put together a list of some of the ways that we can strive to live above reproach. Some of the ways that we can strive to build some accountability into our lives so that we make sure we don't fall into the traps that exist for us. And so here's some methods of accountability that I would consider, or I would encourage you to consider adding into your own life so that you can be sure that people can't question your motives. Here's the first one. Refuse to be alone with a member of the opposite sex who isn't your spouse. You say, that seems really harsh. Well, let me tell you where I'm coming from on this. I've seen lots and lots and lots of people who have been accused of marital infidelity over the years because people see them out, with someone who's not their spouse. They're having a good time. They're laughing. They're carrying on. People say, I think something's going on. Sometimes nothing's going on. Sometimes nothing's going on yet. And sometimes something is going on. Here's the problem. Our reputation is sullied, and there's danger that lurks around those corners. Billy Graham was, again, perfect on this. He said, it's really hard to be unfaithful to your wife when you're never alone with a woman who's not her. There's some wisdom in that. And we should strive to build into our lives this accountability that says, I don't even want a hint of immorality in my life. So I'm going to make sure that when I'm alone if I've got to be with another woman who I'm not married to, that I'm in a public place, that people can see what's going on, that we are not in a situation where we can go anywhere that's inappropriate. I challenge you to take that approach in your life. And some of you are going to say, well, I'm not married, so how in the world is this supposed to happen? I think it's a good principle, even if you're not married, to say, I don't want to spend private, alone time with a member of the opposite sex that I'm not married to. There's way too much temptation, and there's way too many other conclusions that other people can draw about what's going on. It's dangerous. We shouldn't play with fire. And so, maybe you're in a dating relationship. You say, well, we're moving towards marriage. I mean, how are you supposed to get to know someone if you don't spend alone time together? I'm not saying you can't have time that's alone, but don't be in private. Don't go sit in a locked door behind a bedroom door. That's a bad idea. I would challenge you, don't even spend time alone at home together. Go sit out in a restaurant and talk. Go do whatever. We try and take the same approach here when we meet with people. Every now and again as we have to do counseling, we may have to talk to someone of the opposite sex. And we need to talk in private. Well, we've got doors that we can close here, but we never meet with someone of the opposite sex alone. There's always someone else in the building. And even when we have the door closed, there's a window that is right next to our door so that people can see what's going on. So they can see that nothing inappropriate is going on in there. That's the approach that we need to take, is to build this accountability into our lives so that people can't question what's going on, and so that we don't fall into temptation. So that'd be the first thing. Second thing that I would challenge you to do as far as building accountability into your life is to give someone else the passwords to your computer, to your social media accounts, to your phone, to whatever other electronic devices that you have, and then give them permission to check up on what you've been doing on those things. And you say, well, that's an invasion of my privacy. No, it's an attempt to ensure integrity. Here's the problem that I think exists in our culture today. We have this idea of anonymity that exists online, that we can do whatever we want online, and nobody knows because it's not real life. Yes, it is. What we do online is real life. It affects every area of our lives, and so we need to be careful about that. And by having other people who can see everything that's going on, it helps to ensure that we aren't doing things that are inappropriate. They can see what we're doing, and they are able to help us steer clear of dangerous behaviors. I challenge you to keep track of your finances using a budget. Sit down and look at where you spend every dime during the course of a month. And I'd challenge you then to be more disciplined, to say, hey, I'm going to plan out at the beginning of the month where I plan to spend every dime, because it helps to keep us accountable, that we don't have money that's just disappearing. We say, I never have any money. Well, maybe we should try and control our money rather than allowing our money to control us. The same goes with time. Challenge us, sit down some week and keep track of how you spend every hour during the course of your week. Write it down. Put down a day timer and put down each hour. What did you do during that time? Because sometimes it's revealing to us where we spend so much of our time. Sometimes it helps us reveal what our true priorities really are. Maybe you should show that to someone and say, hey, here's an area where I want to change this. Help me. I'm going to try and do this each week. Help me to stay on task on this. If there's something that we learn from what Paul teaches us here, it's that engaging the help of another person, making it a group effort, gives us strength. So maybe you should meet with a group and say, hey, here's 1 or 2 or 3 other people who share my commitment to the Lord. And I'm going to say, hey, I want you to help me to live with integrity in this area and in this area and this area. I want you to ask me about this. Ask me how I'm doing with my Bible reading. Ask me how I'm doing with my prayer time. Ask me if I've been alone with someone of the opposite sex in a way that should have been inappropriate. Ask me how I'm doing with my speech. Am I talking to people in the way that I should? Whatever it is, give someone permission to hold you accountable, because it helps us to build integrity and character into our lives. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not trying to put forth some sort of legalistic rules that you have to follow in order to be a good Christian. That's not what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to tell you that what we need to do as believers is to ensure that we are living with integrity. We need to build accountability into our lives so that people can't question our motives and that we don't fall into dangerous situations. People view Jesus through us. How they view us affects how they view the Lord. Paul understood this. And so he went out of his way to make sure that people had no reason to be able to question him. We need to do the same thing. The truth is, if you think to people who have gone through difficult situations, people who have sinned in some way that it has kind of wrecked their life, I bet you every single one of them would say, hey, you know what I wish I could do differently is I wish I'd have put safeguards in my life to prevent me from falling into this trap, because it's not worth it. We should learn from that. We need to learn to live with integrity and accountability in our lives. So my challenge to you is this: as you leave this place, prayerfully consider what you need to do so that you can ensure that you are living beyond reproach. Will you pray with me? Father, we understand that there's a great deal of temptation in the world. We also understand that we're susceptible to it, and we understand that how we live influences how people view us or view you. So, Father, we pray that you would help us to make the changes we need to live beyond reproach, to cultivate character in our lives, and to live with integrity. For we ask this in Jesus' name.